And Pacho can come up also and take questions. So we'll start.
My question is to Gabon, and this is precisely the part that you didn't have much time to explain. And this is a dilemma that we are facing, particularly in the Northeast India situation, where government is not willing to recognize that there is an armed conflict situation. They are approaching the problem from the other side. So whatever little protection is there in terms of humanitarian law for protection of civilians or hosting combat is something which is not available. Neither is the ICRC allowed to enter. So the crux of the problem that we are kind of grappling with is the definition of what is an internal armed conflict, or where Geneva Convention, that Common Article 3 would apply, or Additional Protocol 2 of 1977 would apply. Again, of course, India has not signed it, and therefore it doesn't apply. So this is a dilemma that we are approaching. One, for human rights, there is again a lot of restrictions for entry of international bodies, but the same applies even for humanitarian law. So we are grappling with a situation where there is a lack of a clear definition on what constitutes non-international armed conflict, or even national liberation movement, or international. There is again, ICRC doesn't seem to have a clarity on this issue, which makes application of humanitarian law so much more difficult. And I have a gift to give you on our work in Manipur.
Thank you. Sophie Haspeslag, I work with Conciliation Resources in London. I've never actually spoken about this in a public setting, but Max, you're giving me the courage to. I was actually a victim of a terrorist attack when I was working for the United Nations in Algeria some years ago now. And I was one of the green people on your map, and I was very lucky to have my life and not even a scratch on me. But I did lose 17 colleagues, and it's deeply affected me. The reason I wanted to share this with you is to raise the question of impartiality and the UN. Because I think as we are discussing the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy at this point, we have to ask ourselves the question, and that's the question I want to ask the panel. To what extent do you think that the UN has lost some of its perceived impartiality in many of the conflicts of the world because of the way it has embraced this global war on terror, or the way it has embraced certain elements of it in the global counter-terrorist strategy, like the listings of certain armed groups? And the key question to you, looking forward, is, well, what should the UN do to rectify this? Thank you very much.
Any other questions? So we'll take that, and then one other, and then we'll go back to the panel.
My question is whether at the global level or even at the national level, are there any positive experiences of victims of terrorism and victims of counter-terrorism, whether it's torture, enforced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, working together? Because I think I have personally been working with many families of victims of state terrorism, and it has been very difficult to find any visibility, any sympathy for victims of state terrorism in Sri Lanka, whereas victims and families of non-state groups, terrorist acts by non-state groups, have found some level of sympathy, even material support.
Just one other person.
This question is primarily for the first speaker, although anyone can comment. Again, my name is Mallory Nodal. I'm with the Association for Progressive Communications. And one thing that we're particularly interested in is very severe actions by states that lead to communications shutdowns, equipment seizures, and essentially, yeah, just over severe actions by states. And what then is especially in Central Asia, because I'm familiar with some cases there. Also, the Internet Governance Forum of 2012 is going to be in Azerbaijan. So I'm curious about what can the role of civil society be to help mitigate the issues that citizens are facing related to surveillance and communications shutdowns. as an alternative to what extremist groups are offering. So what can civil society do to step in and to help? And I don't mean just local civil society, but also the international community, because the internet is quite an international space.
Okay, great. Well, what I'd like to do then is give it to our panelists, starting with Raya, to respond as briefly as possible to the questions, and then perhaps offer Pacho the opportunity, if you want to take it, to say a concluding word, and then we'll have our finishing remarks from Peter. So, Raya.
Thank you for the question. But it's a very difficult question. Why? Because it's not easy, to work in the states where the governments are so difficult, and even more when the governments become the main threat for citizens. For example, in Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, there is no civil society, because according to the last Uzbekistani law, all the NGOs are closed, or some of them have to be re-registered as a business entities. In Tajikistan, situation is also difficult. Even with this GPPAC regional conference, when we had our guests from Europe, so we came 38 people, and we were prohibited to organize our meeting. We wasted the money. There was no explanation why. So it just, no, that's all. In this situation, it is really difficult to work, but it does not mean that we should stop working. The way what could be done, one is, yes, the state as an institution is difficult to work, and sometimes it's just not possible to work. But state means people, and there are always some good people, some entry individuals through whom you can do something. As for the role of international organizations, I think sometimes, for example, in Uzbekistan, so much depends, we talk a lot about values and so on, but as soon as there is business interest, international organizations often forget about the values. Forget that there are violations of human rights in Uzbekistan and continue working because Uzbekistan has gas and other natural resources. Maybe that's what international organizations can do, continue pointing, stressing that there are violations of elementary democratic values and laws. And that's about all. Thank you.
I don't know if the question about the impartiality of the UN to whom it was addressed, but I would like to say something about it. Till the bombing in 2009, I was merely focused politically as a consultant on Indonesia. I'm not here to pretend I'm a UN expert. However, what I could say about it is that if there would be one way for the UN to try and counter violence in an impartial way, it could be to embrace the plight of victims of violence anywhere and give them a podium, a stage, tell their stories and show society what the results are of violence to hopefully teach them that violence is never a solution and creates a lot of pain. But I couldn't say much about what it was until.
I will only address the first question, which is, so my presentation may be fine for situations in which states recognize the application of the laws of war, they recognize the existence of an armed conflict, but what about when they don't? And very often they don't, precisely because they don't want to be bound by the very protections that I've been talking about. So if in Kashmir, for example, India denies the existence of armed conflict, doesn't allow the ICRC in and to visit detainees, what do you do? Well, in that situation, it is still the case that the basic customary rules of international human rights law apply. And if a state says no, they don't, because they're in armed conflict, then they have chosen the armed conflict paradigm. But as long as they deny the existence of armed conflict, as in fact the British did with the troubles in Northern Ireland for many years, the things that can be done are A, if you know your humanitarian law, then you know what the elements of armed conflict are, and that is the existence of a party that's capable of exercising the rights and responsibilities of the law of armed conflict that can be identified, and a certain minimum of either frequency or severity of hostilities attributable to that group, and you can make that assertion. If the state still says no, then of course they are still stuck with the requisites of human rights law. Now, where can that be enforced? Not a lot of places. But there is now the universal periodic review. There is still the potential that there can be political pressure brought to bear. But I understand and admit that the options are few. Indeed, though, it is still better to know your humanitarian law and be able to press it than to not know it and not like it. Finally, I just want to point out that the situations in which states they are claiming that they are at war, therefore human rights doesn't apply, which is incorrect, are much greater than the states that are at war and denying the existence of the law of war and denying the existence of human rights law. And as long as the United States is in the former category, given its influence, that I think it legitimizes the importance of maintaining the focus on humanitarian law.
Okay, thank you. May we ask Pacha to offer a few final words before we invite Peter to come up for concluding remarks.
Calvin, a small comment. You know, I'm sorry for going to Latin. If there is use ad bellum, I mean the right for launch a war, I understand you need use in bello, use humanitarian right or humanitarian law. But if you can prove that there is not use ad bellum, I mean that you cannot justify the war in the country. It's our situation. We are trying to persuade the guerrillas that their war is unjust. And we are trying to persuade the government that the government war is unjust. So that is not case. There is not case at all for use in bello. This is for that point.
May I respond to that?
Please.
I disagree 100% with that. IHL, the law of armed conflict, disagrees 100% with that. Whether a war is a war of self-defense or a war of aggression, which makes a big difference in international law, does not have any effect on whether or not the laws of war, the jus in bello, applies once the hostilities begin. So even if a state should not be exercising their powers under war, even if it is inappropriate, the laws in war still bind that state.
Thank you for your contribution. Thank you indeed. And finally, Max, I was very impressed by your contributions. Thank you very much. And everybody here, your courage and your decision to keep working for peace and counter your enemies and be very positive and proactive. Thank you indeed.
Okay, thank you. Now we'll hear from Peter at the concluding remarks.